Close your eyes for just a moment. It's somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning. The neighborhood is completely still. The street is empty. The only light is from a porch lamp or two, left burning by families who haven't yet gone to bed or who've been asleep for hours and simply forgot to switch it off. The whole world is quiet in that particular way it can only be in the hours before dawn. And then very softly, you hear it. Clink, clink. Glass bottles touching each other in a wire carrier set down gently on your front porch steps. Not carelessly, gently, because he's been doing this for years, and he knows the whole neighborhood is sleeping, and he would never dream of waking anyone up. That sound, that small, musical sound, meant everything was exactly as it should be. The world was turning. The morning was coming. And the milkman had been there. If you grew up in America in the 1950s or the early 1960s, you know exactly what we're talking about. You know that sound the way you know your own name. And if you were lucky enough to have that experience, then you already know there was something about it that no grocery store run, no refrigerator full of plastic jugs has ever quite replaced. Today, we're going back to the porch steps and the cold glass bottles, back to the quiet streets and the snub-nosed trucks idling at the curb, back to the notes left in empty bottles and the man who read every single one, back to one of the most beloved and most quietly, gently lost traditions in American life. This is the story of the milkman. To understand what the milkman meant, you have to understand the world he moved through. In the 1950s, the American morning was a different kind of place. Families were larger, kitchens were smaller. A mother with 3 or 4 children at home could go through 2 or 3 quarts of milk in a single day, for breakfast, for cooking, for the kids who came home from school wanting a cold glass with their cookies. And in the early years of the decade, not every family had a refrigerator large enough to store several days' worth. This is where the milkman came in, not as a convenience, as a necessity. At the peak of the milkman era, and we're talking roughly the late 1940s through the mid-1950s, more than half of all the milk sold in the United States was delivered directly to people's homes, not to a store, not to a warehouse, to the front porch of your house or your apartment building or your little bungalow on the edge of town. More than half. Think about what that means. For a majority of American families, the milkman wasn't optional. He was simply part of how life worked. His day started at a time that most people wouldn't even want to think about. 2 in the morning, sometimes 3. While the rest of the neighborhood was deep in sleep, he was already at the dairy, loading up his truck in the cold. Glass bottles by the crate, heavy, cold, each one washed and sterilized and refilled from the night before, stacked carefully in the insulated body of his vehicle so they wouldn't rattle or break. By the time most families were stirring in their beds, he'd already been at work for hours. The trucks themselves were something worth pausing on. If you grew up in that era, you'll remember them. They were called DIVCOs, made by the Detroit Industrial Vehicle Company, and they had a look unlike anything else on the road. Short, snub-nosed, rounded up front like a friendly face. And here's the detail that made them perfect for the job. The driver could stand up and operate the vehicle at the same time. There was a hand throttle built into the shift lever and a single pedal that handled both the clutch and the brake. Step and drive, they called it. Because when you're stopping at 30 houses on a single block, you don't have time to sit down and stand up and sit down again. You step off, you set the bottles, you collect the empties, you step back on. The truck barely stops moving. The whole neighborhood barely notices. Those trucks could go about 40 miles an hour on an open road, but on the milk run, they never needed to. Slow and steady, street by street, house by house, in the dark. Now, let's talk about what was actually in those bottles, because this is the part that surprises people who didn't grow up with it. It wasn't just milk. Your milkman wasn't just bringing you quarts of whole milk. Depending on your dairy and your order, he might also be leaving cream, real cream, heavy cream, the kind that rose to the top of the milk bottle on its own, if you let it sit long enough. He might be leaving buttermilk, cottage cheese, sometimes butter, sometimes eggs. Some dairies even offered fresh orange juice. A few delivered chocolate milk, which was, as you might imagine, enormously popular with children. You set up your standing order when you first signed on with the dairy. Maybe 2 quarts of whole milk and a pint of cream every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. And then, if things changed, if you had company coming, if you were hosting Thanksgiving and needed extra cream for the pie, you left a note. A small piece of paper tucked into one of the empty bottles you'd left out the night before. Please leave an extra quart this Thursday. Thank you. And he'd read it. And Thursday, there would be 3 quarts waiting for you. This was the system. Perfectly simple, perfectly reliable. And the man running it knew your household better than most of your neighbors did. The milkman knew your name. He knew your family. He knew whether you took buttermilk or regular, whether the family at the yellow house on the corner was expecting a baby and would soon be needing extra, whether the elderly widow at the end of the block sometimes forgot to leave her empties out and needed a gentle reminder. On some routes, in some neighborhoods, the relationship went even further than that. There are people who grew up in the 1950s who will tell you that their milkman had a key to the house, not as a curiosity, as a practical arrangement. In the dead of winter, in northern states where temperatures dropped hard overnight, milk left on an exposed porch could freeze. The cream would push up through the neck of the bottle, lifting the paper cap right off the top. A little flag of ice poking up above the rim. To avoid that, some families kept their milk box inside, in the entryway or the kitchen, and gave the milkman a key so he could come in quietly, make his delivery, and let himself back out. He would step inside before dawn, find the milk box, set the bottles, take the empties, and leave, all without making a sound, all without waking a soul. Think about the trust that required. Think about what it says about the relationship between a family and the man who came to their home every other morning. One man who grew up in Massachusetts in the 1950s remembered this clearly. His family's milkman, a man named Mr. Kirchner from Fairdale Farms, didn't just leave bottles by the door. He would come inside, open the refrigerator, check what was needed, restock the shelves, and take the empties back with him, all based on the standing order, adjusting only when there was a note asking for something different. And who locked their doors in those days anyway? In that neighborhood, in that era, almost nobody. Another man who grew up in New Jersey in the early 1960s remembered his milkman, a jolly fellow named Basile, who wore a white cap and drove a white truck. with particular vividness. Not for the milk, for the coin changer. Basile wore a coin changer on his belt, a little metal contraption that held quarters and dimes and nickels, and he could make change faster than any cashier at any store. For the 5-year-old watching from the kitchen window, that coin changer was the most fascinating object in the world. Basile knew this, and occasionally he'd stop for a cup of tea at the kitchen table, actually sit down, take a rest, have a conversation, and tell stories about his route, including the story of the neighborhood kid who couldn't keep his eyes off the coin changer. Basile would wink when he got to the punchline, because the kid he was describing was right there in the room. That's what you don't hear about when people talk about home milk delivery. You hear about convenience, about cold bottles and fresh cream. You don't always hear about the cup of tea, about the man who knew every family on his route, who noticed when something was off, who was woven into the daily life of a neighborhood in a way that's difficult to fully describe to someone who didn't live it. He was, without ever meaning to be, a quiet guardian of the street. He knew if you'd gone on vacation because your bottles had been piling up uncollected. He knew if a baby had arrived because suddenly the order doubled. He knew if someone was sick because they'd left a note asking to skip this week. And he filed all of this away, not in any formal sense, but in the way a person files away knowledge about people they care about. Because after years on the same route, that's what the families had become. People he cared about, at least a little. Some of the old houses still carry the evidence of all this, if you know where to look. Built into the exterior wall, usually near the back door or the side entrance, you'll sometimes find a small compartment, maybe 12 inches wide, maybe 18 inches tall, with a little door on the outside and another door on the inside. The milk chute. The outside door for the milkman, the inside door for the family. Some of them are painted over now. Some are sealed shut. Some have been converted into electrical panels or simply bricked up and forgotten. But they're still there, in the bones of older homes across the country, quietly holding the shape of a morning routine that no longer exists. And then slowly, it ended. Not all at once. That's important to understand. The milkman didn't disappear in a single season. The change happened over the course of a decade and a half, driven by several forces at once, none of them dramatic on their own, but all of them pulling in the same direction. The refrigerator came first. By the mid-1950s, nearly every American home had one, a real electric refrigerator, not an icebox, and it was getting larger and more efficient every year. Suddenly, you could buy milk at the store and keep it cold for days. The daily delivery was no longer quite as essential. Then came the supermarket, those gleaming new stores that seemed to carry everything. And there, right in the dairy aisle, was milk. Cheaper than the milkman. Convenient. And Americans had cars now. The suburbs were spreading out. A weekly grocery run was part of the new rhythm of life in a way it had never been before. Then came pasteurization at scale. Milk that could sit for a week in a carton without souring. When milk lasted that long, you really didn't need it delivered every other day. You could stock up the same way you stocked up on soup cans and cereal boxes. By the early 1960s, the decline was real. By the early 1970s, fewer than 1 in 10 American households still had home delivery. By 2005, the last year the government tracked the number, Less than half of 1% of all milk sold in this country came from a milkman. The trucks went quiet. The routes were retired. The dairy ledgers were packed away. And what did we lose exactly? Not just the milk. We had plenty of milk. We still do. We lost the sound of glass in the dark, and the specific comfort of knowing that someone had been there, had done their work, had taken care of things, while you were still asleep. We lost the notes in the bottles, and the small wordless conversation they represented. A family's needs, a man's attentiveness, a relationship built over years of early mornings. We lost the milkman's key on the hook by the door, and everything that key stood for. We lost a kind of neighborhood life that was made of small, daily rituals of trust and recognition. The milkman was one thread in that fabric, and when he went, quietly, before sunrise, the way he always went, the neighborhood felt just slightly more like a place where people lived near each other, rather than a place where people lived with each other. Some things really were simpler then. Do you remember your milkman's name? Do you remember the sound of those bottles on the porch? Or the cold weight of one in your hand on a winter morning? The cream sitting thick at the top? Do you remember leaving out your empties the night before? Like setting the table for a guest you'd never actually see? Tell us in the comments below. We would love to hear your story. And if this took you back, if it brought someone to mind, someone you haven't thought about in years, a street, a porch, a sound, please send this to someone who would smile, someone who remembers. We'll see you next time, right here on Memory Lane.